Good evening, everybody, and welcome. This is part 5 of our ongoing exploration of the works of Stalin, collected together in one volume entitled On the Opposition, exploring. I'm just going to show you the book there. It's the version I'm working off. You can find a ebook version of this on the website. And what we're looking at today is a work from 1924 from Stalin entitled October Revolution and Tactics. And this was written, partially at least, in response to various attempts made by Trotsky to insert himself, and more specifically, his interpretation of things, of the October Revolution in particular, and the way it came about into the official narrative of things. And Stalin is contesting this in this particular piece of writing. So what we're going to do is going to, as usual, explore some of the key points that Stalin is making here, and then we will pause for questions. So I'm going to be speaking for around about half an hour or so, and then questions and comments can be taken afterwards. So let us begin. This was the preface that was written for the book On the Road to October. And we can learn some key things here about Stalin's view, developing from Lenin's view, on the questions of the tactics which led the Bolshevik Party to be able to successfully prosecute the October Revolution. What is focused on in terms of the critique of Trotsky here is twofold. Firstly, it's his view with regards to the necessity of the revolution spreading to the advanced capitalist nations, the imperialist nations, and that without that, the October Revolution is doomed. That's a view that Trotskyites still hold to this day, and Stalin contests that. Next, we find a discussion of Trotsky's view of the peasantry and their role, and again, the inaccuracies in his analysis of this, and the question of how the Bolshevik Party tactically conducted itself in 1917, leading up to the revolution, and also the role that the Soviet Union plays, or played at the time and throughout its history, as the center of global revolution, and how this differed from Trotsky's view of things. So we will proceed with an initial look at Trotsky's obsession with Germany. This is an obsession which I think Trotsky had throughout his life, and it came from, in theoretical terms, a real place, which was that there was this long-standing belief in Marxist circles in the early part of the 20th century that if the revolution was to succeed, then it would have to either happen or spread quickly to an advanced industrialized nation. And at the time, even after the defeat in World War One, the advanced industrialized nation which seemed ripe for revolution was Germany, given that it had been defeated and humiliated by the Versailles Peace treaty. And one of the themes in Trotsky's writings of the late 1900s, early 1920s is this fervent desire to see the revolution spread to Germany. Now, of course, all of the Bolshevik leaders, Stalin amongst them, shared this desire. But there is a crucial difference, as there always is when we're looking at Trotsky's work. Often what you find when you read Trotsky is that in the 1920s and 1930s, is that, especially I would say in his work in the 1920s, he often comes across as, of course, the way he portrayed himself, the great revolutionary. And you often find in his writings a lot of revolutionary phrases, a lot of things which the version of myself that first got interested in Marxism 20, how long ago is it now? 25 years ago. So 1999, when I was 17. You find when you're first looking at it that it sounds all very impressive. But when you get more experienced and you start to see and understand more clearly what scientific socialism actually means, and start seeing the process of revolution, the process of party organization, the relationship with the masses as a scientific practice, you understand more clearly why and how all forms of revisionism, including Trotskyism, go so incredibly wrong, whilst sounding as if they are a really revolutionary perspective. And the thing with Trotsky that you see over and over again is that he takes the basis of a point, but then goes in a completely incorrect direction with it. So no Marxist at the time disagreed with the idea that it would be a huge benefit for the Russian Revolution if the German workers were to triumph and overthrow the German ruling class, to bring Germany into a period of revolution, to institute Soviet rule in Germany, which almost happened on a number of occasions up to about 23 to 24. And nobody would have disagreed with that being an incredibly positive thing. The problem with Trotsky is not that he believes in that, it's that he substitutes the German Revolution for the development of the proper development of the revolution in the Soviet Union, meaning that Trotsky over and over again says that without the German Revolution, in particular the German Revolution, that the USSR is lost, and he says this on numerous occasions, and we're going to talk about some of those as we go forward. But whereas the view articulated by Lenin and then developed by Stalin was that, of course, they wanted to see that, but by 1924, when Stalin is writing this, the great masses of the workers and peasants in the Soviet Union had already proven themselves in terms of their being willing and able to fight for their revolution and to preserve it. And they proved themselves yet again in the 30s as being capable of, if organized properly and drawn together properly, of actually joining the fight for rapid industrialization and collectivization. And the revolutionary spirit of the proletariat and peasantry in the Soviet Union proved to be such that it overcame the backwardness of the Soviet Union. And this, of course, blew Trotsky's theory to pieces, as he almost has to admit in his book, The Revolution Betrayed, where he has to spend the first chapter talking about all the magnificent achievements of the 5-year plan and trying to avoid the fact that it blew his idea that the technical level in the Soviet Union was too low, that they couldn't industrialize properly without assistance from the Germans. This was an obsession of his, which was proved to be manifestly wrong. So this is one of the things that this particular work is looking at. So the other points to make, and this goes back again to Trotsky's errors on the peasantry and his theory of the permanent revolution, was with regards to the alliance with the peasantry and the permanent revolution. Now, let's remind ourselves what the permanent revolution is. First of all, Trotsky takes this from a man named Parvus, who was an interesting character, to say the least, was a guy involved in various business ventures, including arms dealing. But the theory of the permanent revolution, again, to go back to the point we were making a moment ago about doing scientific analysis when it comes to revolutionary theory and practice, when it comes to revolutionary tactics and strategy. The theory of the permanent revolution, again, when you first read it, and as I first read it as a very naive 18-year-old, it sounds like really what happened in the Soviet Union, because what Trotsky says in his book on this, which was he did an extended theoretical work on it later. But the earliest one is, I believe, called One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. I think that's the case anyway. Yes, just checking it off on the bookshelf there. So in the earliest version of this, which I believe I'm correct in saying was written slightly before the 1905 revolution, Trotsky lays out the theory of the permanent revolution. And what he means by this is that in Russia, Russia is so backward and the bourgeoisie so craven in its capitulations and its compromises with Tsardom that the bourgeoisie is incapable of actually making a revolution against Tsardom. Now, so far, one might think, well, so good. This is agreeable. Trotsky goes further, and this is where the errors start to come in. When Trotsky's conclusion, drawn from the fact that the very real fact that the bourgeoisie in Russia prior to 1917 was too feeble and too terrified of the proletariat and the peasantry to make a revolution, that it clung like a limpet to the Tsardom and was much in a much a similar way than the German bourgeois did. When they saw the rising workers and peasants in 1848, they were much more inclined to make a deal with the Kaiser and the Prussian Junkers than they were to side with the working class. So Trotsky's theory, as far as it went on that with regard to the Russian bourgeois, started from a correct place. Where it starts to go wrong is the next part. And it starts to go wrong when Trotsky deals with the question of the peasantry and the question of what should happen with regard to the historic tasks of the bourgeois revolution. Now, the historic tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, as this is often referred to, are things like land reform, breaking up of the big estates, the breaking up of the big aristocratic estates and the redistribution of land amongst the medium and small peasants. This was a task that was assigned to the bourgeois revolution, and it's a task that was often compromised on by the bourgeoisie. So, for instance, there's a certain compromise with the Prussian Junkers in what was to become unified Germany, in that the bourgeoisie was prepared to not do land reform there in any significant way, and allow the Junkers and the big landowners of Prussia to retain their historic power. Now, one of the reasons why the bourgeois revolution has to break up the landed estates is to break the power of the feudal aristocracy. Now, if we go back to the British case, because our bourgeois revolution, I'm going to argue, and this is an argument I will be making in an upcoming book, which I'm starting to rough out the draft for at the moment. Our bourgeois revolution actually comes in several waves. The conclusion of it is what the historian Christopher Hill referred to as the century of revolution. So around about like 1602 to 1603 to about 1714, or going all the way up, in fact, to 1745, and the final defeat of the Jacobite restorationists of the House of Stuart. That century brings to a close a lot of other changes that have been going on since arguably the time of just after the Wars of the Roses. If anybody's tuning in from Yorkshire tonight, be sure to close your ears. The land reform process here actually takes place over a much longer period of time, is the point I'm making here. What you see is that feudalism in this country, and this might be, in fact, it is one of the reasons why we were the first capitalist country. Feudalism starts breaking down arguably in this country with the Black Death, which is the bubonic plague, which ravaged the peasantry and indeed large sections of the aristocracy in the 14th century. That started the process of breaking down feudalism, because it killed so many peasants and so many landlords that in actual fact it enabled a vast consolidation of landholding and started the process by which the serfdom got broken down because there was too few peasants left, and there was a process started by means the means of which the peasants were paid started to go towards wages rather than old feudal obligations. So because this happened first, this unleashes a certain number of processes, and then you get various land reforms which promote the what I would call farming in a more capitalist fashion. done also by Henry VII. You get the breakup of the big church estates by Henry VIII and the taking of their gold, and that helps the growth of the early bourgeoisie. And then, of course, this is consolidated under the reign of his daughter, Elizabeth I, because what's the reign of Elizabeth I is about the full transition to absolutism in this country. So absolutism in Britain, arguably, and again, there's different views taken by different historians on when this starts. Absolutism in Britain, I would say, is built up by Henry VII immediately after the Wars of the Roses, consolidated further by his son, Henry VIII, he of 6 wives fame. This is where absolutism is consolidated, and the breakdown of the feudal system goes further. See, the Wars of the Roses were a sign of the breaking down of the feudal system. The fact that it all burst out into the open, into a destructive war that lasted many, many years and produced a lot of good plays by Shakespeare, incidentally. But what you get at the end of it is the absolutist state. The absolutist state, which, first of all, further breaks down the power of the old landed gentry, of the old feudal estates. You get absolutism starting to be created by Henry VII, consolidated by Henry VIII, which is really what the attack on the monasteries and the disestablishment of Catholicism in this country is really all about. And this is a rather long digression, but please bear with me. The disestablishment of Catholicism, the dissolution of the monasteries, the confiscation of the land of the church, or a huge chunk of it, and the confiscation of the money of the church, the gold of the church, the severing of the link with Rome. This is all done under the banner, or partly under the banner, of the Reformation, but it's got a peculiarly English twist to it, which is that if you were brought up in the Church of England tradition, which many of us were, if you're English on the stream tonight, maybe you'd like to comment. But I mean, I was baptized myself, but I was sent to Church of England influenced schools. If you observe the religious rites of the Church of England, if you go to any Church of England, small church or cathedral, what you observe is that what essentially we have in this country is a sort of nationalized Catholicism, which is what Henry VIII did. He took all of the things about the Catholic Church and just changed it, really, so that the head of it was not in Rome, the head of it was in London, and the head of it was him. And so this is a consolidation of power by the proto-bourgeois, by the early bourgeois. You get the decline in power of the feudal aristocracy. You get the growth in power of merchant and banking capital. And you get the foundations of what became British capitalism being built at this time. And so the point, to return here to the point about land and peasantry and land reform, this is all part of a long process which reaches its denouement in 1642 to 1649 for the first wave of the revolution, and then the revolutionary dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell going up to 1660. But the revolutionary process doesn't stop with the death of Cromwell or the restoration of Charles II, or even the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, and then the attempted counter-revolution by the House of Stuart going all the way up to 1745. Point about this is all a process by which capital asserts itself as the dominant force in the ruling class. So you have that land ownership changes over hundreds of years, but this breaks out into violent revolutionary acts. So the dissolution of the monasteries is a violent revolutionary act. Really is. It's the upturning of hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition in this country and the change to a different form of state religion, which we still have in this country. Everybody forgets this. I'm sure J.D. Vance doesn't know, but Britain, formally speaking, is an official Christian nation. And if you read, as I have been doing today, the bills being brought before Parliament, it's all conducted in this language of official state-sanctioned Christianity. His Most Divine Majesty, King Charles III. Well, where does his divinity come from? Apparently, it's the Almighty himself. Who knew? The conclusion of every bill refers to the temporal powers of the lords, etc. I mean, it's all bullshit, of course, but it brings home to you the fact that the state is an officially Christian one. Again, you wouldn't know it quite a lot of the time. If you're going about your business in Britain, but when you run into the official language, yeah, it's all conducted in this Christian language, because that's what Henry VIII did. He nationalized religion and turned it to the purposes of the new bourgeois. Maybe he didn't know that was what he was doing. He wanted a divorce, and this was one way that the ambitious bourgeois reformers saw as utilizing a king's foibles to get themselves what they wanted, which is severing the link with Rome, which was, of course, a key source of power for the old Catholic nobility. So we move on to talking further about land reform and the peasantry. So the reason why, of course, our land question had, if not been settled, then it had been largely resolved, and it was finally brought to a conclusion by the repeal of the Corn Laws. So our bourgeois revolution, because it lasted so long and went through so many phases, and so many very destructive and bloody phases as well. Again, the ruling class don't like to talk about that. But a very thoroughgoing land reform it was, in that even those aristocrats who held on to their land had essentially changed the mode of production that was practiced on the land. I mean, Karl Marx talks about this in Capital Volume 1. The mode of production on the land had been turned definitively capitalist, being run by wage labor, and was even though the land was owned by an aristocrat, it was worked in a very ruthlessly capitalistic fashion. So our land reform stretched over a much longer period of time. And here we come back to Trotsky and the Russian peasantry. And so because we were so far out ahead, i.e. the British so far out ahead, is because the bourgeois revolutions here had come first. The aristocracy had reached a bargain with the capitalists, which is basically the aristocracy got to keep their titles and got to be the intellectual servants and political leadership of the bourgeoisie, but they took their orders from the bourgeoisie. So those who wished to catch up had to overcome the dead hand of the feudal aristocracy which remained. So in France, the reason why, or a big part of the reason why the revolution is so violent and dramatic, is that they are trying to do in a few years what the British had done over centuries. So over centuries, the aristocracy is either dispossessed or repurposed by the bourgeoisie. In France, because the absolutists, absolute monarch, and the feudal reactionaries had held on for so long, the productive forces had no longer be restrained by the feudal carapace. And so the class contradictions there explode suddenly and incredibly violently. But let's never forget that the process by which land was reformed in Britain was also incredibly violent. It just took place over a much longer period of time and involved periods of slavery, by the way. So land reform becomes key for bourgeois revolutions because land reform is seen as a way to break the power of the old feudal aristocracy. So in France, that was done to a degree, though, of course, because of the consolidation of power behind Napoleon and then Napoleon's defeat and the restoration, the feudal aristocracy did hang on for quite some time afterwards, longer than they did here. Of course, here they were repurposed. Germany, same problem. But again, they reach a bargain in Germany. Spain is crippled in terms of its development of capitalism because the big landowners, latifundistas, remain in power and remain in power well into the 20th century and impose pronunciamientos, as they were called, precisely to avoid and block any attempt at land reform, even from like bourgeois liberals. And this, of course, cripples the development of capitalism in Spain. And when it does emerge, it emerges as a very stunted, very weak creation. So, turning back again to our old friend Trotsky. Trotsky identifies a problem with the Russian bourgeois. The Russian bourgeois being too weak and too feeble to take on the feudal aristocracy, and to be being unwilling to carry through the land reform that was urgently required to basically make the land more productive, and also to disempower the feudal reactionaries. And Trotsky says, correctly in some of his earlier writings, that, well, the bourgeoisie isn't interested in doing that, so the proletariat must do it. Here we get to the problem. We get to a problem because the way that Trotsky presents this is that he presents it as that the bourgeois phase of the revolution can be jumped over. So the bourgeois democratic phase of the revolution can just be jumped over by the proletariat. And remember Trotsky's view on the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. He doesn't see it as an alliance. He sees it as the proletariat will lead the peasantry and dictate to it. Now let's just jump back for a moment to talk about socialism as a science, revolution as a science. If part of your process is wrong, it's like doing an equation wrong. If one symbol or one number in it is incorrect, it unbalances the whole thing. The whole series of calculations then will be wrong. And here we get back to why Trotsky's formulation can lead to such disastrous consequences. Again, it's like getting a number wrong when trying to do a long formula. I would compare it perhaps to the formulas one would do in physics. So a subject I'm trying to relearn following years of neglect, by the way. So what Trotskyites do often, and Ernest Mandel does this when he tries to defend Trotsky. He was saying, well, Lenin in 1905, when immediately afterwards was talking about a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, and Trotsky was talking about permanent revolution and the need for the proletariat to lead the peasantry, and essentially they're talking about the same thing, which isn't true. So what Lenin makes clear and what Stalin makes clear constantly is that in the Russian situation, the proletariat needs an alliance with the peasantry. It doesn't and shouldn't be dictating to the peasantry. Remember the very first couple of articles that we looked at from Stalin in this series on the trade unions and what Trotsky's attitude was towards the workers and the peasants there, which is that Trotsky, being a petty bourgeois, son of a landowner, the nephew of guys who are very big names in the capitalist world in what was then Tsarist era Ukraine, part of Tsarist Russia. Trotsky's whole attitude towards peasants and indeed workers is one of, it will be the way I say, and if you don't like it, then we'll compel you at gunpoint. That was his attitude on the trade union question. It's also his attitude on the question of the peasantry. Lenin's counterpoint and Stalin's counterpoint is that, and this comes back to the point about the permanent revolution, we can't just skip over the land reform stage. This is one of the problems in the so-called theory of the permanent revolution. Trotsky says we skip over that. The proletariat leads the peasantry beyond that, and then we go immediately into things like collectivization, which Trotsky was advocating for. Lenin and Stalin's point is, well, we can't just do that. And here's the point that Stalin is making in this work. The revolution in Russia cannot succeed without a firm alliance with the peasantry. We don't get a firm alliance with the peasantry without promising them land reform and redistribution of the great estates, not immediate collectivization. And again, Trotskyists will try and elide over those differences, try and smooth over those very real, very significant differences between Trotsky's theory and Lenin's theory. See, under Lenin's formulation, which Stalin took forward, the peasantry had land redistributed to it. Under the NEP, you even got the growth of the kulaks in the countryside. You even got re-emergence of speculation and things like that. But again, they had to adopt a land reform policy that was actually taken from the peasant populist party, the Social Revolutionaries. And when Viktor Chernov, the SR leader, whinged about this, Lenin said, well, you only talked about it, we've actually done it. But what does that lead to? It leads to, and this is a point that Stalin makes over and over again, the peasants get to see the effect of this land reform process. And because they get to see the effect, some of the effects of this, which is the growth of kulaks, the re-emergence of new forms of exploitation by the kulaks in the countryside, what it does is it shows the small and medium peasant who doesn't have a lot of land still, that with the emergence of kulaks, what you're ending up with is just another form of landowner, often who is just as brutal and cruel and cynical as the old aristocracy. And so what that does is it shows the peasantry through their own experiences the value of collectivization. And the value of collectivization, which can then be demonstrated by setting up the model collective farms. Now, do you see the difference here? The difference being between Trotsky pointing a gun at some peasants and saying, hard luck, guys, hard luck, scum, get on that fucking collective farm that I, the great Trotsky, have designed for you. Get on it or we'll fucking shoot you. Because that was Trotsky's attitude. He is the son of a landlord, after all. He regarded the peasants as subhuman. Difference between the Leninist policy and that, which is carry out the land reform, allow as part of the NEP, because of the NEP, we've covered it before, new economic policy, the necessary retreat after the destruction of the Civil War. You then show the masses what happens in the land reform and the restoration of certain capitalist relations in the countryside. You're then able to set up the collective farms and try and bring the peasants around to collectivization via force of demonstration, having then had them see what happens with the bourgeois land reform after 1917. Do you see the difference? Yes, it took at least another decade after the end of the Civil War, 1921, to around 1931, for collectivization to finally get off the ground. But in that decade, the peasantry's consciousness came on, and of course the Bolsheviks had strong cadres in the countryside, often not enough. Often there's like one communist covering hundreds and hundreds of miles of countryside and having to talk to thousands of peasants. But again, you have the masses go through the process and learn, because, and again, this is a point that Lenin and Stalin keep coming back to over and over and over again. The masses are capable of learning and are capable of drawing the revolutionary conclusions if it is presented to them in the correct way, consistently argued for, and they are able to learn by having the demand come into action in front of them. So the demand for land reform, which had been there in the under the Tsardom, which even Tsarist officials like Stolypin had unsuccessfully tried to do land reform, but had failed because of entrenched opposition from the big landowners. Stolypin, incidentally, was probably killed on the payroll of the Okhrana. There's nothing new under the sun, everybody. The Okhrana were pioneering these tactics before anybody else was. The crucial point to remember here is that, and this is the real difference. Stalin argues forcefully in this for the need for the proletariat. Yes, the proletariat is the leading force, but without the alliance with the peasants, it doesn't work. And you can't compel the peasants by gunpoint into an alliance with you. Trotsky got very excited at various different points in the Civil War because, yes, they were basically ruling by necessity by military decree. And Trotsky was good at that. That's why he thrived in a Civil War situation, because he was able to go around ruling by decree, played to all his talents. But after the Civil War is over, you can't carry on like that, as Stalin argued. So, just read you a quote here from Stalin to demonstrate the point. This is from page 144 in this copy that I am reading from. The revolutions in France in 1848 and 1871 came to grief chiefly because the peasant reserves proved to be on the side of the bourgeoisie. The October Revolution was victorious because it was able to deprive the bourgeoisie of its peasant reserves, because it was able to win these reserves to the side of the proletariat, and because in this revolution the proletariat proved to be the only guiding force of the vast masses of the labouring people of town and country. So, the point there that Stalin is making is the absolute necessity of having this alliance. And he goes on to elaborate this further. He who has not understood this will never understand either the character of the October Revolution or the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat or the specific characteristics of the internal policy of our proletarian power. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not simply a governmental top stratum, skillfully selected by the careful hand of an experienced strategist and judiciously relying on the support of one section or another of the population. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the class alliance between the proletariat and the labouring masses of the peasantry for the purpose of overthrowing capital, for achieving the final victory of socialism on the condition that the guiding force of this alliance is the proletariat. So keep in mind what we're saying about the scientific approach. Guiding force does not mean doing everything at gunpoint. It means the proletariat guides the peasantry. It does not compel the peasantry. These look like small differences. But again, if you're at all familiar with scientific processes, and again, I'm only just starting to reacquaint myself with the hard sciences, but you will be aware of the fact that the small difference in any scientific process can lead to a disastrous outcome if there is something wrong in your calculations. And if Trotsky's approach to the peasantry had been used, a disaster would have followed. So also bear in mind what Stalin is saying there about the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's not that all classes are immediately abolished after the revolution. That's a long, long process which takes many, many decades, if not centuries, to finally achieve. What's the case is that the proletariat, as the truly revolutionary class, takes up the leadership of society. And that's the point. The proletariat takes the leading position, but it is not the only class there. You still have the peasantry in the Russian case. Wouldn't be true in our case in Britain, but it will be true in a lot of countries still across the world. Places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, most of the South American nations, most of the sub-Saharan African nations, there is still a peasantry. So these lessons are still live for the bulk of the world. And I would suspect also in certain areas of Eastern Europe as well, maybe not as much. But for a lot of the world, these lessons are still live and still valuable. It's only us in the West which see ourselves as having gone beyond them now. So, point about this is, the dictatorship of the proletariat, yes, leads multiple different classes behind it. The proletariat is at the head, and the Revolutionary Party at the head of that. But behind that come along all the different classes which are being led by the proletariat and guided by proletarian ideology. At various different stages, there will have to be sharp and difficult discussions amongst and with the different classes. There will have to be various different times, there'll have to be moves forward and retreats to keep this alliance that supports the dictatorship of the proletariat together. There will need to be various different approaches taken, dependent upon, of course, the consistent interaction between the Communist Party and the masses, between the Communist Party of the proletariat and the Communist Party and the different classes within the dictatorship of the proletariat, with the proletariat as the guiding force and exercising its dictatorship to take society forward. And again, there are many different classes there, and there are many different aspects to this struggle, as all the great revolutionary leaders have written about. So, moving. So this is that there is the problem with Trotsky's permanent revolution and Trotsky's attitude to the peasantry. So, moving on to look at a couple of other points that we want to be making here. Now, Stalin talks about the fact that the law of uneven development that has been expanded upon by Lenin should be studied in terms of what those who wish to understand the October Revolution, and the fact that the October Revolution was able to be successful in Russia was in part down to the fact that there was this uneven development between the imperialist countries and the weaker imperialist country. In this case, it was the old Russian Empire. So that's an important factor in the development of the revolution as well. But what I wanted to talk about was when in this particular section of the book, Stalin talks about the strategy and tactics, or more specifically, the tactical approach used by the Bolsheviks in 1917. And it wasn't just a case that it was, military tactics. Now, what Stalin talks about is again, we go back to the relationship between the party and the masses. Stalin talks about the fact that the masses were in tumult all the way through 1917, constant demonstrations from pretty much April onwards. And the Bolsheviks joined a lot of these demonstrations and joined them with the slogan of all power to the Soviets most of the time. And at that stage, Stalin is saying that the Bolsheviks are in an extended process of trying to win over the proletariats of the great urban centers in Russia over to the program of the Bolsheviks. Because at the time, from the February Revolution onwards, the Soviets are actually controlled by the Mensheviks and the Social Revolutionaries, and they are supporting the government headed by, at the time, the Cadet Party. Now here we get to Stalin's analysis, and I think it's a very useful analysis for us to take on at this moment in time with regard to the focus of the criticisms and the polemics of the Bolshevik Party. Now, in the early period before the revolution, and immediately after it, the Bolsheviks focused their criticisms, their polemics, etc., an awful lot on the Cadet Party. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from this because I think it's worth going into in full as to what Stalin is talking about here. So I'll read you from 164 to 165 here. The preparation for October thus proceeded under the leadership of one party, the Bolshevik Party. But how did the party carry out this leadership? Along what line did the latter proceed? The leadership proceeded along the line of isolating the compromising parties as the most dangerous groupings in the period of the outbreak of the revolution, the line of isolating the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. What is the fundamental strategic rule of Leninism? It is the recognition of the following. The compromising parties are the most dangerous social support of the enemies of the revolution in the period of the approaching revolutionary outbreak. Point 2. It is impossible to overthrow the enemy, Tsarism or the bourgeoisie, unless these parties are isolated. Point 3. The main weapons in the period of preparation for the revolution must therefore be directed towards isolating these parties, towards winning the broad masses of the working people away from them. In the period of the struggle against Tsarism, in the period of preparation for the bourgeois democratic revolution, 1905 to 1916, the most dangerous social support of Tsarism was the liberal monarchist party, the Cadet Party. Why? Because it was the compromising party, the party of compromise between Tsarism and the majority of the people, i.e., the peasantry as a whole. Naturally, the party that at that time directed its main blows at the cadets, for unless the cadets were isolated, there could be no hope of a rupture between the peasantry and Tsarism, and unless this rupture was ensured, there could be no hope of the victory of the revolution. Many people at the time did not understand the specific feature of Bolshevik strategy and accused the Bolsheviks of excessive cadetophobia. They asserted that with the Bolsheviks, the struggle against the cadets overshadowed the struggle against the principal enemy, Tsarism. But these accusations, for which there was no justification, revealed an utter failure to understand the Bolshevik strategy, which called for the isolation of the compromising party in order to facilitate, to hasten the victory over the principal enemy. So, the point to emphasize here, the point Stalin is hammering home here, is that in the period before the revolution and immediately after it, before the overthrow of Tsarism, I should say, the Bolsheviks are focusing on analyzing the positions of the cadet party and exposing their weaknesses, exposing their collaborationist nature, because the cadet party appeared as the party of the liberal Russian bourgeois to be the party that was going to lead the struggle against Tsarism. But of course it wasn't. It was never interested in that. They were the political representatives of the very weak Russian bourgeois, who we've already talked about their weaknesses. And that needed to be exposed in the eyes of the masses, because what the cadets are, as Stalin says there, is they are the compromising element that will ultimately move to save Tsarism. And that's what they wanted. The cadet party wanted a constitutional monarchy. And if they couldn't get that, they would be prepared to go in with Tsardom as long as Tsardom made some concessions to them, as they did over the course of 1905 to 1914 and in the war as well. They only moved towards wanting pure bourgeois rule when it became obvious they couldn't find a candidate to take over from the completely useless gimp Nicholas II. And by the way, it will never stop being funny to me that like extremely online right-wingers have made Nicholas the fucking second into some kind of icon. Like, why not do Charles I while you're at it? Or Louis XVI? You know, but then again, these are the same online right-wingers who are obsessed with that loser Hitler. So what are you going to do? So the point to go back and emphasize here is that this applies to our situation now, what Stalin's talking about here. The whole essence of the Bolshevik criticism towards the cadets is precisely because the cadets are the compromising factor, which they look like they want to get rid of Tsarism, but are in actual fact Tsarism's greatest defenders. And again, this applies to our situation now. Take our situation in Britain. Why is it the case that in the case of my own party, the CPGB-ML, Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, we spend quite a lot of time criticizing not only the Labour Party, but all the other various different aspects of the British left, which will lead people back towards the Labour Party. It's because the Labour Party is, of course, the party that will actually always act to save British capitalism. And therefore, our criticism has to be not only directed at them, but also all the things that support them. So, our aim as communists has to be to break the allegiance of the masses from the Labour Party and Labourism. And again, the masses are getting there already. A lot of them are turning their back on the Labour Party, and with good justifications. They're not turning to communism yet. They're turning into all kinds of weird and not so wonderful things. Or they're just dropping out of any political engagement whatsoever. But the power of Labour and Labourism, the power of social democracy, is now the thing for us which has to be broken at this stage. And without that, there can be no move forward. So you get, when you criticise the Labour Party and also all the other things on the British left which lead people back towards the Labour Party, so they're like the fake communists in the Communist Party of Britain, for instance, with their British road to socialism, which mysteriously always ends up with them voting Labour again, or calling for people to vote Labour again, or the various trot parties that scream and shout in ultra-revolutionary phrases 3 years out of every 4, and then when it comes to election time, either run some crap campaign that nobody notices or lead people back towards the Labour Party. Or why we criticise the trade union bureaucracy, not just because of its role basically as having been incorporated into the management structure of the British state, which it has, but also because of the fact that it uses its role and its relationship with the Labour Party to suppress working class struggle. So we spend an awful lot of our time critiquing and explaining the role of the Labour Party, the role of the trade union bureaucracy, and the role of the British left, which leads people back towards social democracy. And as a consequence of that, we get accused of being, oh, you're anti-trade union. Well, no, we're anti the way in which the unions in this country, just like the unions in the United States have been led down a dead end. They've been led down a dead end by people who want to justify the ongoing relationship with the Labour Party and the ongoing relationship with the bankrupt Social Democrats. Same would be true in a lot of other countries as well, a lot of the other imperialist countries like France, like Germany, like Spain, like Italy, a bit of a different situation because the old social democracy died. But where the old social democracies exists, there we have a case where they have become the principal barrier. They look like they offer change, not very much these days, but enough people still buy into the idea that they should. Therefore, the principal target of our criticism at this stage has to be them. And again, you get accused of the same thing. The Bolsheviks were accused of getting in the way of overthrowing the Tsar. Whereas we here, and if you're an American Marxist-Leninist watching this, maybe you get accused of getting in the way of defeating fascism, getting in the way of defeating Donald Trump. Well, in actual fact, the biggest defenders of the worst of American imperialism, of US imperialism, are in fact, at the moment, the Democratic Party, the trade union leaders, who are just as much invested in this as the Republican leaders are. Rhetorically speaking, they're more invested in it. More on that in future episodes. So that's the thing. You have to, because we want to break the ideological stranglehold that Labourism, social democracy in Britain, or the Democrats and all the things that lead back to the Democrats in the United States, the working class has to be broken away from them. Yeah? And so that means if you're in the US, that also means ruthless criticism, as comrades are doing right now, of the CPUSA, of the so-called Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is a fake pseudo-Leninist outfit run by a bunch of Trotskyites who cosplay as Leninists. But again, always take people back towards the Democrats again. And again, that's the priority, to break that. You know, at least the Trump supporters or in the working class have got pissed off enough to break with the Democrats. It's not much, but it's a start. So that's the thing to bear in mind. We target our criticisms at what is the immediate barrier towards the consciousness of the masses moving in a revolutionary direction. And that immediate barrier to us right now is social democracy. Stalin goes on to talk about the how then this has to shift. So you destroy the cadets by exposing them and exposing their role in actually supporting Tsarism and then supporting the continuation of the imperialist war. But then you have to shift, because then you're in the period after February 1917, and the cadets are in power, but they're supported by the people who run the Soviets. So whilst you're saying all power to the Soviets, you're doing that, the Bolsheviks are, in the full knowledge that at the moment you are a minority in the Soviets. And as Stalin says in this work, that is because Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership understood instinctively the revolutionary potential in the Soviets, and that this would form the basis of the new proletarian state. And therefore, it's entirely correct to advance the slogan, all power to the Soviets. And it's entirely correct to do that, even when the Mensheviks and the SRs are in charge of them. But just because you've got two reformist, treacherous parties in the majority at the time, that doesn't change the revolutionary nature of the Soviets themselves as organs of working class power. And so Stalin says it's entirely right to call for all power to the Soviets, whilst at the same time ruthlessly exposing before the masses the inadequacies of the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. So, what Stalin says in this next part is that, so you shift from criticism of the cadets to ruthless criticism of the Mensheviks and the SRs, whilst at the same time you call for all power to the Soviets. Because what you force then the Mensheviks and the SRs to do then is to show their inadequacy. You demonstrate in front of the masses that not only do the Mensheviks and the SRs not actually want power, because they actually don't, but that they are invested in continuing to support the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, continuing to support the cadets or Kerensky in the maintenance of the bourgeois government that emerges out of the February Revolution of 1917. So you call upon essentially the Mensheviks and the SRs to take power themselves through the Soviets. And at the same time, as Stalin says in this section of the book, you call for complete freedom of agitation. You call for maximum civil liberties to enable you to make your message understood as widely as possible. So, what Stalin's outlining here is that you compel the Mensheviks and the SRs to show their inadequacies. You consistently say to them, well, we must have all power going to the Soviets. And then you force them and the leaders of the Mensheviks and the SRs to essentially decline power, refuse it, which many of the reformists have done in this period. One of the famous examples is in Britain, where Lloyd George, in the early 1920s, I believe it was 1921, when there was a big transport strike going on at the time. There was a big alliance between the free union groups in transport, energy, and I think it was the final one was engineering. I could be wrong about that though. But he invites the three big union leaders into 10 Downing Street, and he says, "Gentlemen, I won't do the Welsh accent just in case there's any Welshmen watching and they get offended by the fact that my Welsh accent is terrible." Lloyd George, born in Manchester though, by the way, that's a mark of some dubious nature there, says to the three union leaders, he brings them into Downing Street, he sits them down and he says, because the nation's on strike, the bourgeois government in Britain couldn't repress all of these characters, all of the masses that had risen in 1921. He knows that basically he has to find a way out of this because they can't use just straight up state repression to compel all these workers back to the workplace again. He has to try and destroy the strike another way. And he hits upon a way which is essentially he calls the bluff of the union leaders. So he invites them to number 10. He sits them down and he says, "Gentlemen, if you want power, it's yours. I can't stop you." He sits them, he looks them in the eye and he says to these union leaders, "If you want to take power, you can do it right now." And of course, he's gambled correctly, because these union leaders in 1921 were of the same character as the union leaders in 2024. 103 years later, it's the same layer in charge, the same rottenness. Here, in the US, Canada, France, everywhere else, the same response would be given. They shit themselves. They didn't want power. They didn't want the task of having to reorganize society. They had no real faith in the masses. They just wanted the employers to be a bit, they wanted the employers to offer them a deal. Employers weren't offering any deals in 1921. The state of British imperialism was too dire for them to offer deals. So they capitulated. And Lloyd George gambled correctly. So what Lenin and the Bolsheviks were saying to the reformist leaders was in 1917, take power. You have the majority in the Soviets. Take power. Lead the revolution. They couldn't. They wouldn't. It was against everything in the Menshevik program to do so. The SR program was, confused and all over the place, but they basically followed, they had the allegiance of the peasants, and they basically followed the political leader, the Mensheviks. So the Bolsheviks demonstrated into the eyes, in front of the masses, the inadequacies of those whom the masses had entrusted thus far, because the opportunity was there to not just overthrow the Tsardom, but to end the war, to redistribute land. Remember the Bolshevik slogan, peace, bread, land. Yeah? The Mensheviks and the SRs could have done it via their control of the Soviets. They didn't. And so through all the tumult of 1917 and with some deviation, Stalin makes the point that they kept saying all power to the Soviets, kept saying peace, bread, land. And eventually, after months of agitation and political and real battles, what happens is the masses of the workers and then the peasants work out that, well, these guys aren't serious. The social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks don't want to end the war. They're, as the Bolsheviks say, beholden to the imperialists because they're beholden to the Russian capitalist class and beholden to the landlords. And so you relentlessly expose the barrier to progress then in the revolution is the role of the compromisers, the Mensheviks and the SRs. And as Stalin says, by assuming those tactics, they overcame them. So, other points to be emphasized here. Stalin talks extensively in the book about the genius of the Russian worker and peasant, because it's the Russian worker and peasant who created the Soviets in the first place, all the way back in 1905. So, we move on to talk about a couple of the other major points to cover here. So the other point that Stalin makes here is the difference between the party being a vanguard party and then the party leading the vast Russian masses. And so I'm just going to read to you another quote. This is from page 100. For the victory of masses in their millions, a correct party slogan is not enough. For the victory of the revolution, one more necessary condition is required, namely that the masses themselves become convinced through their own experience of the correctness of these slogans. Only then do the slogans of the party become the slogans of the masses themselves. Only then does the revolution really become a people's revolution. One of the specific features of the tactics of the Bolsheviks in the period of the preparation for October was that they correctly determined the paths and turns which would naturally lead the masses to the party's slogans, to the very threshold of the revolution, so to speak, thus helping them to feel, to test, to realize by their own experience the correctness of these slogans. In other words, one of the specific features of the tactics of the Bolsheviks is that they do not confuse leadership of the party with leadership of the masses, that they clearly see the difference between the first sort of leadership and the second, that they therefore represent the science not only of leadership of the party, but of leadership of the vast masses of the working people. And that's the point. It's not enough just to go before the masses and shout slogans. You have to be able, as far as you can, to map out the response of the masses to those slogans. So remember everything that we've just been talking about here, about the fact that what the Bolsheviks aimed in terms of their criticisms, who they aimed them at, when they aimed it at them, what tactic they used it, and what slogans they raised at each different twist and turn in the revolutionary process. The aim of all of this was to have the masses come to the Bolsheviks as a result of their own direct experiences, and with the Bolsheviks there constantly amongst the masses, amongst the workers, amongst the peasants, making the arguments, and sometimes they wouldn't be listened to for months on end. But eventually they were, because the revolutionary process played out in such a way as that the cadets, the Mensheviks, the SRs, all exposed themselves bit by bit. And because the Bolsheviks had a strong enough, although it was quite relatively small at first, organization, it was basically a strong organization in the militant sections of the working class. It grew, but they grew and grew because the masses saw the truth in their words via their own experiences. And because the Bolsheviks were there to make those arguments constantly, often they weren't listened to the first time, second time, third time, fourth time, but they were listened to in the end. And when they were, the masses then embraced the line of the party and embraced the Bolshevik leadership of the revolution at the crucial moment. And so again, it's a case of scientific testing. You're testing, how does the slogan work with the masses? Does it work? Does it resonate? Is it correct? Is it bringing the masses forward? Is it exposing the enemy? And if it's not, then we need to reformulate. You have your cadre out amongst the masses, reporting back to the leaders of the party saying, well, this is working, this isn't. This is going down well, this isn't. This is helping expose the Mensheviks, expose the SRs, this isn't. The reactionaries are making a move here. The Mensheviks are responding with this here. An effective communist party, well rooted in the working class, is like it's like a constant process of like a permanent feedback loop. Basically, you have the feedback from the masses coming up through the party cadre to the party to the central committee. The central committee considers this, debates it out, comes up with a refined line, a refined tactic, a refined slogan, a refined demand, sends that back to the cadre communists on the ground, who go and test it with the masses and find that if it works better, well, what about it works better? And then the report comes back again via the party to the leadership, reconsidered, back again. This is a constant process. And it is in this that part of the strength of the Leninist model of organization lies. So, moving to the final part of our discussion here, and I realized I have, when talking about this work by Stalin, have gone over my half-an-hour designated slot, but I hope you have found it enlightening. So, I'll conclude by talking about, again, starting where we've, this particular section, we, of course, draw to a conclusion, and then we come to a conclusion where we started. Very circular process of learning here. Now, we started by talking about Trotsky's Germany obsession and his lack of faith in the Russian masses. So, what does this mean? This means that Trotsky managed to mischaracterize and misunderstand the significance of the revolution, but also what it meant to build socialism in one country. Now, Stalin makes the argument here in this final section about how the Bolsheviks were able to take power in in the weakest link in the chain of imperialism, but also what that meant now. And now I'm just going to read the quote here to you that comes towards the end of this section, where Stalin says the following: "The world significance of the October Revolution lies not only in the fact that it constitutes a great beginning made by one country in causing a breach in the system of imperialism, and that it is the first center of socialism in the ocean of imperialist countries, but also in that it constitutes the first stage of the world revolution and a mighty base for its further development." So, how do we contrast this with Trotsky? Trotsky argues constantly and in a very whiny fashion that the revolution needs to expand. And again, he keeps saying this all the way into the 1920s. Unless we expand, we are doomed. Stalin says, look, we have reached the point where, due to the establishment of the Soviet Union, we now have a global center of revolution, which, due to its mere example, is now challenging the role of the bourgeois, challenging the rule of the bourgeois everywhere. It's challenging the imperialists. It's causing huge problems for them. And that this remains a center of global revolution. And the strength of the revolution lies, of course, partly in the solidarity between the masses of the Soviet Union and the masses of even of the imperialist countries. But again, the Soviet Union's task now is to build socialism. And by doing so, you, as a center of global revolution, strengthen the fight for socialism everywhere else, both in the oppressed nations and the imperialist countries. And Stalin has a later quote, not in this particular work, but where he says that without the Soviet Union, if it were to collapse, then the decades of the blackest reaction would set in. And that is exactly what we live in now. We live in the blackest reaction. Might not look at it, might not look that way when you're first looking at this. When you're first sort of considering the world, when you're looking at what kind of a country you live in. But once you look at everything that's happened in the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it remained a center of revolution up to the very end, I would argue, up to about 89, then the counter-revolution really took hold. I'm 42 years old now. I know I don't look it, but it's losing your hair early. That's the secret to youth. My entire life, I was born in 1982, has been one where we grew up at times of the blackest reaction. And again, look at all the things that we talk about day to day. Rotting culture, rabid individualism, bizarre, perverse so-called lifestyles being paraded around on the internet. The active promotion of pornography, of narcotics, of alcoholism by capitalism. And that's just domestically in the imperialist nations. The most heinous wars that have been waged across the world in the restoration of slavery in a place like Libya, the killing of millions upon millions by imperialism, whilst, of course, imperialism keeps up information walls around their countries that make it that seek to render the population ignorant of the crimes that go on. The collapse into learned helplessness, old phrase, that you see all around you, that particularly of men, that becomes more and more prevalent. Arrested development, particularly of men. The collapse and atomization of working class communities. An atomization which, by the way, has been partially brought on by the very success of welfare statism. My comrade Jyoti makes this point I think she's made it in some of her discussions with Garland Nixon. You can see on Fridays on his channel. Welfare statism was the necessary reform that capitalism granted. However, what it did was it transferred much of the working class's autonomy that it had within the system. It transferred it to a bureaucracy. So now, rather than leaning on each other, we lean on a bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy took away a lot of the old bonds of solidarity that used to exist. Now, this point was taken up and cynically manipulated by Thatcher and Reagan and the other reactionary liberals of the 1980s. But it doesn't remove the kernel of truth within what I've been saying, which is that when people criticize the welfare state period for making people dependent upon the state, there is an element of truth in that, and it's quite a deliberate thing that has been done by the bourgeoisie to break the bonds of working class solidarity and solidarity and community. Yes, reactionaries of all stripes will try and use that to agitate against welfare for the privatization of various different things. But the essence of the point is still true. And we as communists must acknowledge that and move away from this knee-jerk social democratic defense of welfare capitalism and argue correctly to the working class, who will understand this to a great degree already, that period is past and it is bankrupt, but also that period was a double-edged sword. Yes, the working class got a lot out of it in terms of some beneficial reforms, but it came with a price, and that price is further atomization. All right, so I will bring this to a conclusion in terms of my talk this evening. I noticed that somebody in the chat noted that they'd never heard Stalin's voice. So let's hear from Stalin himself then. This is, I'm going to share a screen with you here, so you can see Stalin's announcement of the German. Here and see and hear Stalin's speech on the announcement of the German invasion. Bear with me just a moment.
Товарищи, граждане, братья и сестры, бойцы нашей армии и флота, к вам обращаюсь я, друзья мои. Вероломные военные нападения гитлеровской Германии на нашу родину, начатый 22 июня, продолжается. Несмотря на героическое сопротивление Красной Армии, несмотря на то, что лучшие дивизии врага и лучшие части его авиации уже разбиты и нашли себе могилу на полях сражения, враг продолжает лезть вперед, бросая на фронт новые силы. Над нашей Родиной нависла серьезная опасность. Как могло случиться, что наша славная Красная Армия сдала фашистским войскам ряд наших городов и районов? Неужели немецко-фашистские войска в самом деле являются непобедимыми войсками, как об этом трубят неустанно фашистские хвастливые пропагандисты? Конечно, нет. История показывает, что непобедимых армий нет и не бывало. Армию Наполеона считали непобедимой, но она была разбита попеременно русскими, английскими, немецкими войсками. Немецкую армию Вильгельма в период Первой империалистической войны тоже считали победимой армией, но она несколько раз терпела поражение от русских и англо-французских войск. И, наконец, была разбита англо-французскими войсками. То же самое нужно сказать о нынешней немецко-фашистской армии Гитлера. Эта армия не встречала еще серьезного сопротивления на континенте Европы. Только на нашей территории встретила она серьезное сопротивление. Если в результате этого сопротивления лучшие дивизии немецко-фашистской армии оказались разбитыми нашей Красной армией, то это значит, что гитлеровская фашистская армия также может быть разбита и будет разбита, как были разбиты армии Наполеона и Вильгельма. Что касается того, что часть нашей территории оказалась все же захваченной немецко-фашистскими войсками, то это объясняется главным образом тем, что война фашистской Германии против СССР началась при выгодных условиях для немецких войск и невыгодных для советских войск. То войска Германии, как страны, ведущие войну, были уже целиком отмобилизованы. И 170 дивизий, брошенных Германией против СССР и придвинутых к границам СССР, находились в состоянии полной готовности, ожидая лишь сигнала для выступления. Тогда как советским войскам нужно было еще отмобилизоваться и придвинуться к границам. Немалое значение было здесь И то обстоятельство, что фашистская Германия неожиданно и вероломно нарушила пакт о ненападении, заключенный в 1939 году между ней и СССР, не считаясь тем, что она будет признана всем миром стороной нападающей. Наша страна вступила в смертельную схватку со своим злейшим и коварным врагом, германским фашизмом. Наши войска героически сражаются с врагом, вооруженным до зубов танками, авиацией. Красная армия и Красный флот, преодолевая многочисленные трудности, самоотверженно рвутся за каждую пять советской земли. В бой вступает главная сила Красной армии, вооруженный тысячами танков и самолетов. Храбрость воинов Красной армии беспримерна. Наш отпор врагу крепнет и растет. Вместе с Красной армией о защиту Родины поднимается весь советский народ. Прежде всего необходимо, чтобы наши люди, советские люди, поняли всю глубину опасности, которая угрожает нашей стране, и отрешились от благодушия, от беспечности, от настроения мирного строительства. Враг жесток и неумолим. Он ставит своей целью захват наших земель, полит их нашим потом, захват нашего хлеба и нашей нефти, добыт их нашим трудом. Мы должны немедленно перестроить всю нашу работу на военный лад, все подчинив интересам фронта и задачам организации разгрома врага. Наша война за свободу нашего Отечества сольется с борьбой народов Европы и Америки за их независимость, за демократические свободы. Это будет единый фронт народов, стоящих за свободу, против порабощения и угрозы порабощения со стороны фашистских армий Гитлера. Наши силы неисчислимы. Создавшийся враг должен будет скоро убедиться в этом. Все наши силы на поддержку нашей героической Красной армии, нашего славного Красного флота. Все силы народа на разгон врага. Вперед за нашу победу!
Well, there you go. I thought I'd show you the whole thing. It's an inspirational speech, but you notice that one of the reasons why Trotsky loathed Stalin so very, very much was because Trotsky was the more flowing and eloquent speaker, and also I think I'm right in saying that Russian was Stalin's second language. I think he grew up speaking Georgian. An interesting side note. So, well, that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion today. I hope you've all enjoyed this and got something out of it. This will be added to the playlist on YouTube. I'm just going to roll through some greetings to people who've joined us. So we had Working Prole from Austria. Comrade Jawad joins us from the southwest. We have Nikki Const, William Moore, Potted Rodent, T.G. Wilson, Arnold Sack. I'm going to butcher the second half of your name here, mate. Sack Newsoim. Peter joining us from Perfidious Albion. Almir from the once and future Yugoslavia. Otis joining us. James Graham, Boris M, Tim Gray, who said, I remember this line from when I almost joined the SWP as a student, and they never discussed the counter-arguments. Thankfully, I never joined them. Lucky escape there for Tim. Steve Choate joined us from the Northwest, Georgia, USA. Colchester Ian is with us. Beju, good evening to you, comrade. Brad is with us, as is Jenny, and Jenny says, YouTube censored my good evening comment. Yeah, it's really bad at the moment for censorship on YouTube. Comments are just disappearing. I'm not seeing any of them. I'm not seeing a lot of them that come up. Potted Rodent, good evening. Albert says, I was brainwashed by the Church of England and only broke free when I was nearly 30 years old. Well, at least you did get to break free. Some never do. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Abtin, good evening to you. And we have, here we go. Almir, who says most of the Trot fan clubs are in the Western countries, right? In other parts of the world, most people don't touch that shit, probably. That would be my guess. Yeah, the Trots have, like, they've had a presence in Argentina for years. I think because it was a little more urbanized and there was, like, bigger student groups there. They've had a presence across South America, actually, which isn't good. But in most of the African nations, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, not a lot of anything going on there. Almir says, so Trotsky was the real red fascist, not Lenin and Stalin. That's exactly correct. The Risen People era is enjoying the program, and I thank you for coming along. Hello to Dave in West Yorkshire, who has joined us. Sheikh Tara is with us and says, hi, Tara here, and I say hello back to you. The Risen People era is liking the Nicholas the Second GIMP comment. Well, it's true. Moving through the comments. It was Morgan who asked, said that he'd never heard Stalin's voice. Well, happy to be of service there. Ocean2035 on Twitter, or X, says, Social Democrats are wolves in sheep's clothing, however, and must be exposed. However, tailing the right wing or libertarian, not taking working class to right path or break down the cycles of manipulation by a monopolistic system. Keep in mind the leader of the democratic bourgeois parties or right-wing libertarians are corrupted and vassals of imperialism, but the mass of working people who follow them are not. Therefore, leading them to other parties and hoping them the other... Okay, your comment kind of got cut off there, but I get what you mean. Yes, ruthlessly criticizing the Social Democrats does not mean leading the proletariat or any proletarians towards right-wing liberals, be it Donald Trump or anybody else. You know, the whole point about Stalin's analysis is that the first thing we have to do is to break the power of the most immediate barrier. So to us, it's the Social Democrats that are the most immediate problem that stop the proletariat from developing revolutionary consciousness. In other times, that might change and that calculation might have to be remade, but that's the calculation at the moment. And the calculation will never be, and therefore we should vote for Donald Trump or endorse Donald Trump. That would be opportunistic bullshit, as Ocean2035 is pointing out. Reverend Ripple was born in 1976 and refers to us as younglings. Well, I'll allow the reference, considering George Lucas is a fan of Soviet cinema. Comrade George, you're welcome on the program to discuss any Soviet sci-fi films you might want to come on and discuss. I know you're pretty bored these days. The billions do not buy entertainment, do they? Jenny says, are you judging my bisexual furry polycule? I very much am. Though I regard that as a joke, of course. You are joking. Alexander Fuchs, good evening to you. Dan Lindstrom, good evening to you. Eric Parcells, glad you're enjoying the Stalin speech. Mary says Stalin spoke Russian with an accent all his life. Well, yes, indeed. He was a man of the Georgian peasantry, who has been frequently voted Russia's greatest ever leader. And you can hear the teeth grinding of the Russian petty nationalists as he does. Probably voted Ukraine's greatest leader as well, but will be very soon. Right. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this evening. Join me tomorrow for an analysis of the King's Speech. And I don't mean the film with Colin Firth. I mean the utterances of King Charles the Last. And as far as I could tell, he didn't ask for a full pardon for his old friend Jimmy Savile, but I'm sure that's in the small print. So, thank you to everybody who's tuned in this evening. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee. You can find the links to do so in the show notes. The audio of this will be up on Patreon tomorrow. Next episode of this will be next week, and it will be focused on the work of the 14th conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik. So it's quite a long one, this. It's 3 sections rather than just one. So we're going to be looking at the 14th Congress next week. So thank you for joining me. Be sure to join me for the next one. And I bid you good evening from Perfidious Albion.